On the evening of October 12, the Cleveland County duty operator received a call from a resident of the Norman Heights apartment complex in the city of Norman, Oklahoma. The man reported briefly, a woman lay motionless at his neighbor's entrance, unresponsive to attempts to communicate. He emphasized that he did not dare approach closely, as he feared possible consequences, and preferred to call for help immediately. The operator clarified the address, contacted the nearest patrol car, and simultaneously dispatched an ambulance. The call was logged in the database at 1932. Within a few minutes, the first police officers were on the scene. The scene they encountered immediately appeared strange. A woman lay on her back by the door of one of the complex's townhouses, showing no signs of consciousness. Her pulse was barely discernible. A head injury was noted, but there were no signs of struggle around. The door was closed, the lock intact, and the house's windows were not broken. The entrance area was clean, with no scattered belongings or signs of forced entry. Several minutes later, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics began resuscitation efforts right there. Her pulse was unstable, her breathing intermittent. The woman was transferred to a stretcher and, accompanied by police, taken to the emergency room of the nearest hospital. At this point, the incident was still classified as a medical call. Further events unfolded at the clinic. Doctors conducted a full examination, a severe head injury accompanied by internal hemorrhage. Her condition was immediately assessed as critical. The woman was connected to equipment and underwent emergency procedures, but even after these, no improvements occurred. She remained unconscious and prognoses were extremely cautious. The attending physician informed the police, "The condition is extremely grave, chances are minimal." This automatically elevated the level of attention to the case. The next day, doctors noted a deterioration. By the morning of October 14, a conclusion was issued. The injuries sustained were incompatible with recovery. Her death was officially pronounced. From this moment, the incident ceased to be merely a medical case. It now became a criminal investigation. Investigators had to determine exactly what happened at Mrs. Harris's doorstep and who was involved. The events unfold in the Norman Heights residential complex, located in the city of Norman, Oklahoma. This area was a typical example of an American suburb. The houses were mostly brick, built according to a single plan. Each had a neat yard with a well-maintained lawn, a standard fence, and a driveway for a car. The atmosphere here always seemed predictable and calm. Neighbors knew each other by name, chatted at gatherings, and helped each other with minor household issues. In the evenings, the streets came alive. Someone walked their dogs, someone went for a run, and someone simply sat on their porch with a cup of coffee. The crime rate in the area was low. Police rarely came to Norman Heights, and mostly for minor issues. Someone complained about a noisy party. Someone had a bicycle stolen. Sometimes domestic disputes were recorded. All of this fostered a sense of security. It was common for local residents to say, "Nothing serious ever happens here." That is why the tragedy that occurred later was perceived as something incredible. But if one looks closely at the picture, the first alarming signs began to appear long before October. In the spring of 2023, complaints began to arrive at the police station. First, one family reported a missing cat. A week later, another. The same, then a third. Complaints about missing pets became repetitive, but no one connected them into a single picture. Police recorded the statements in the log and did not attach much importance to them. Reports indicated that the pets might have simply run away. At that time, no one thought that these disappearances were related to something more serious. The next signal came in the summer. Trash caught fire in a dumpster near the school. When firefighters extinguished the flames, it turned out that plastic toys were burning inside. Some items were completely charred, but metallic parts were visible among the remnants. To the police, this looks like a hooligan act. The incident was closed quickly, without opening a separate investigation. All these events seemed fragmented at the time. The disappearance of animals was perceived as a series of everyday occurrences, and the burning dumpster was attributed to teenagers who decided to have some fun. No parallels were even drawn between the cases at the station. But it was in these trivialities that the first signs began to be seen later, that what was happening in Norman Heights was not accidental. Neighbors described life in the area as absolutely calm. One resident said, "I could easily leave my door unlocked and go grocery shopping, and it never even occurred to me that it was dangerous." Another man recalled, the most serious incident we had was when teenagers were being noisy after a football game. For the police, Norman Heights was an area where one could not expect trouble. That is why what happened at Mrs. Harris's house became a turning point. It was the first serious crime in the complex's history. What was once perceived as a safe and familiar place suddenly turned out to be the point where a chain of events began that changed the lives of many people. The next step in our story is the moment when the police first encountered the real picture of the incident and began to piece together the first facts into a single investigation. Any such story has its starting point, and it is always connected with the simplest at first glance actions. Police officers begin with the basics. They record the address, the time of the incident, call for additional patrols and medics. But the most important thing is the first area canvass. Officers go to houses around the crime scene, knock on doors, talk to people who live literally next door or across the street. All testimonies are recorded in a report, even if it concerns seemingly insignificant details. Someone heard a noise, someone noticed a light in a window, someone saw a familiar car. In such trivialities, the most important clues are sometimes hidden. In parallel, a list of the victim's contacts is compiled. This means that investigators retrieve recent calls, messages, and note with whom she communicated most often. All names are included: relatives, colleagues, neighbors, casual acquaintances. Such a list usually grows quickly. Dozens of names, different addresses, different connections. But it is precisely this list that allows investigators to outline the circle of people who might know something or be involved. By the end of the first day, the investigation already had an impressive list for questioning. This is routine, but no investigation can do without it. Here, the first important signal appeared. Several neighbors reported that in recent weeks, they had repeatedly heard loud arguments between Mrs. Harris and her nephew. According to them, the conflict almost always revolved around money. The man asked for financial help, and the woman refused, which caused scandals. Against this background, it turned out that the nephew indeed had serious debts. Official documents confirmed his problems with loans and frequent borrowings. To the investigation, this seemed extremely logical. If there is a financial crisis, there is a motive. This information immediately singled out the nephew from the other figures on the list. He turned out to be the only one who not only had personal contact with the woman, but also a clear, tangible motive for conflict. In the materials from that period, one can find the phrasing, "Circumstances indicate the presence of a mercenary interest." Investigators believed that this version required priority verification. After analyzing the testimonies and facts, the police decided to give the nephew a special status: person of interest. This is a legal term used when a person is not yet a suspect, but their actions or life circumstances draw increased attention. For the investigation, this meant one thing: the first serious direction of inquiry would be the version of an attack for profit. In the protocols of that period, this version is clearly stated. The logic seemed ironclad: debts, constant conflicts, emotional arguments, and a clear motive. Everything fit into a coherent picture. Investigators focused on working with this line. At that moment, no one could have predicted that this was just the first step in a long chain that would lead to entirely different conclusions. Thus, the investigation made its first stop: the version of a mercenary crime committed by a relative. But in the future, it was precisely this certainty that would play its role when new facts forced the investigation to change direction and search further. This is where forensic experts come in. Their actions, at first glance, seem monotonous and even routine, but it is this work that determines the subsequent course of the investigation. The examination begins with the most obvious things. Doors, windows, and locks are recorded. Every detail is photographed from different angles so that a complete picture can be reconstructed during analysis. The front door is photographed in both open and closed positions, with close-ups of handles, keyholes, and hinges. Then, attention is turned to objects in the hallway: dust, stains, shoe prints. All are meticulously documented. The work then moves inside. Forensic experts examine carpets, take samples from upholstered furniture, and even note such trivialities as packages left on a table or an unfinished cup. All of this combines into a comprehensive data set: traces, samples, photographs, and diagrams. Each finding receives its own number to avoid confusion later. Ultimately, a crime scene examination report is compiled, and this document alone can span dozens of pages. It records every detail, from the placement of a chair in the living room to the condition of the front door lock. It is on such details that investigative theories are later built. Yes, and this proved to be an extremely important point. On the path leading to the house, forensic experts noticed a sole print. The ground, soft after a recent rain, retained a clear impression. Initially, no one paid much attention to it. Such marks can be accidental and could belong to any passerby. But specialists decided to document it, just in case. The print was photographed using a scale ruler, several angled shots were taken, and then a plaster cast was made to preserve the exact relief. Even then, it became clear that this print could determine not only the shoe size, but also the characteristics of wear. Such minor irregularities and cracks on the sole sometimes make it possible to link a print to a specific pair of shoes. When the expert results arrived at the department, investigators received an unexpected turn. Experts clearly indicated the print belonged to a small-sized shoe. It did not match an adult male. Moreover, the shape and depth of the print suggested that this footwear was light, without the characteristic weighting of adult models. The cast parameters more closely matched sneakers typically worn by teenagers. This became the first serious contradiction in the case. After all, the initial version was built around an adult with a clear motive, a relative who had debts and a conflict with the deceased. All the facts seemed logical: motive, opportunity, potential gain. But the evidence obtained from the expertise shattered the coherence of this version. The motive pointed to an adult, while the print suggested something entirely different. From this moment, the investigation ceased to be linear. The police realized that the case would not be limited to a simple check of immediate relatives and their alibis. There was a need to consider a wider range of versions, including those that initially seemed improbable. And it was this contradiction, an adult motive versus teenage evidence, that became the key point from which the investigation moved forward. According to established rules, in such situations, the person with the most coincidences regarding motive and circumstances cannot remain unattended. The victim's nephew immediately came under scrutiny after neighbors were interviewed and spoke of his debts and strained relationship with his aunt. The police decided to bring him to the station for official questioning. This is a standard step. Even if guilt has not yet been proven, any lead must be thoroughly investigated. He was led into the interrogation room, a room with white walls, a camera in the corner, and microphones that recorded every detail of the conversation. 2 investigators were present. One kept notes and clarified details. The other monitored reactions and asked direct questions. The atmosphere was businesslike, without pressure, but formal. Every word was recorded, and the accuracy of those words determined the direction of the entire investigation. It is in such moments that contradictions are often revealed, either strengthening suspicions or completely dispelling them. Thus began the official interrogation procedure. When asked to explain his whereabouts on the evening of the incident, the nephew immediately stated his position. He emphatically denied any involvement in the assault. Furthermore, he presented a concrete alibi. According to him, on the day of the incident, he went to Sooner Mall. There, he met a friend, went to the cinema, and then visited one of the grocery stores where he made a small purchase. To corroborate his words, he even specified the store's name and described the location of the checkout counter where he paid. Investigators immediately noted the details: the specified location, cinema, and stores. All were areas equipped with video surveillance cameras. Moreover, in the case of a purchase, bank card transaction data or a receipt should have been preserved. His story was structured in such a way that verification became a matter of technicality. Yet, the intrigue remained. A person with a clear motive presented an alibi that, at first glance, seemed convincing. The investigation now had to verify his words. This required requesting footage from the mall's cameras, interviewing store and cinema employees, and cross-referencing bank transaction data. If even one link in his story proved true, suspicion against him would significantly weaken. If discrepancies were found, his alibi would collapse, and he would remain the prime suspect. Thus, a new phase of work confronted the detectives. The main theory, murder for greed committed by a relative, seemed logical and understandable. But the evidence in the form of a small shoe print found near the house already hinted at a possible contradiction. Now, everything depended on verifying the nephew's alibi. This step was to show whether he was truly at the mall at the time of the incident, or if his words were merely an attempt to hide behind a convenient story. The investigation moved forward, and this verification was to determine whether the nephew would remain the main suspect, or if police attention would shift to another figure. How do you verify an alibi in the digital age, when every human action leaves a trail of small but important clues? This question became central for investigators when they received the nephew's initial testimony. On the one hand, he had a clear motive: debts, conflict with his aunt, a possible argument over money. On the other hand, he insisted that he was at the shopping mall at the time of the attack. Checking such statements is standard practice, but here it took on special significance, as it concerned the main theory they had focused on from the very beginning. The first step in verification involves surveillance camera footage. Sooner Mall is a large building with cameras installed almost everywhere. At central entrances, side doors, inside corridors, near the grocery store, and in the parking area. Investigators requested all materials for the evening of the incident. Viewing them took hours. Detectives rewound the footage, paused at every frame, and checked the exact time. And then, the result. Footage from one of the cameras showed the nephew entering through the main entrance. His face, clothing, and gait were captured. The date and time were displayed at the bottom of the screen. Everything matched that very evening. This became the first solid proof that his words could not simply be dismissed as an excuse. But one video was not enough. The camera might have shown him entering the building, but there was no guarantee that he did not leave a few minutes later, reach the Harris neighborhood, and then return. For the investigation, it was crucial to rule out such a possibility. Therefore, they continued to look for independent confirmation. The next step was bank transactions. An ordinary person rarely spends an evening at a shopping center without leaving a digital trace. Purchases, cash withdrawals, card usage in cafes. Requests were made to stores and banks serving customers in this shopping complex. The result was not long in coming. A receipt was found in an electronics store. The time of purchase coincided with the key period when the attack on Harris occurred. The item was simple, a small phone accessory, but this fact played a crucial role. The salesperson, later interviewed by the police, recalled the transaction. He noted that the customer asked many questions, chose a model, and lingered at the display case. Thus, another confirmation appeared in the case. The person was physically inside the shopping center, not in the residential complex. Now, the investigation had two independent sources: video footage and a financial transaction. Together, they created what is called a rock-solid alibi. This was not just a hint or an indirect coincidence, but facts that could not be refuted. For the police, this meant one thing: the theory of a mercenary crime by a relative completely collapsed. At the legal level, his status was re-evaluated. If initially he was considered a person of interest, after verification, he was removed from the list of suspects. A clear statement appeared in the protocols: suspicion not confirmed, alibi checked and confirmed. For the Harris family, it was a blow. They were convinced that he might have been involved. For the police, it was a return to the starting point, when the most logical theories ceased to exist. But the investigation could not stop. Against the backdrop of the collapse theory, all attention shifted to what was previously considered a secondary detail. This referred to the sole print found near the victim's house. At the time, it seemed like minor evidence, but now the print became the only lead. The peculiarity was that the print belonged to a small-sized shoe. Experts immediately identified it as teenage. From this moment, the direction of the investigation changed. The main motive, related to the adult relative and debts, was dismissed. Only a strange piece of evidence remained, which contradicted the initial logic of the case. The investigation had to take a more complex path to find out who this footwear might have belonged to and how this person ended up nearby at the time of the tragedy. This print now became the center of attention, opening a new line of investigation and changing the entire perception of what had happened. How do you find one person with a specific shoe size in an entire residential area? This question became key for investigators after the initial theory involving the nephew was dismissed. All they had left was a sole print, clearly not made by an adult, but even that was enough to continue the search. In the context of the Norman Heights neighborhood, considered prosperous, safe, and practically free of crime, this task seemed like finding a needle in a haystack. Nevertheless, they could not stop. Investigators decided to return to a method proven for decades to direct conversations with neighbors, but now with a different set of questions. Previously, immediately after the incident, resident interviews were general in nature, asking about possible conflicts, who last saw the victim, and who passed by her house that evening. Nothing significant came of it then. Now the emphasis shifted. Detectives asked a direct question. Had anyone noticed strange behavior among young residents or anything that stood out from the usual neighborhood scene? And the first conversation showed that the right direction had been chosen. People began to recall things they had not paid attention to before, and unexpectedly testimonies from different neighbors began to converge. In several houses, the same surname was immediately mentioned: Lewis. Residents recalled a family that kept to themselves. The adults rarely interacted with neighbors, and their son, according to the eyewitnesses, was withdrawn, often alone, and seemed detached from everything around him. One neighbor said, "He always walked by himself. He looked at the ground, didn't greet anyone, could appear in the most unexpected places." Such characteristics did not yet make him guilty, but the fact that different people independently pointed to the same family was a signal for the police. The name that first appeared in the case files was Ryan Lewis. At the time of the events, he was about 12 years old. He was described as quiet, avoiding others, sometimes sitting on the porch for long periods or wandering in the vacant lot near the school. Several neighbors noted that he rarely participated in group games and more often observed from the sidelines. Someone said his gaze was lost or troubled. All of this could have been simple personality traits, but in conjunction with the found footprint, such testimonies began to play a role. Investigators went further. They began to compare the stories with already known minor incidents, and new coincidences emerged. One resident reported seeing Ryan on the day plastic toy remnants caught fire in the dumpsters. At the time, it seemed like a typical teenage prank. Another neighbor recalled that it was Ryan who was wandering around the yard when the Sanders family's cat went missing. And again, at the time, no attention was paid to it. But from a new perspective, such details looked different. A chain of circumstantial connections emerged. A shoe print matching a teenage size, seclusion and aloofness in behavior. Regular mentions of his presence near minor incidents that, at the time, seemed accidental. All of this did not provide solid proof, but formed a basis for a new theory. In forensics, such coincidences are called background information that helps the investigation establish direction. At this stage, Ryan Lewis officially came to the attention of the police. For now, he was not a defendant, not even a suspect in the legal sense, but his name appeared in the protocols for the first time as a person to be investigated. It was from this moment that the investigation began to unfold in a new direction, where every small detail, every past episode, now carried an entirely different weight. Next came the most important part, to verify if there was a direct connection between the existing evidence and this person. And this is where the investigation had to take the next step, building on the circumstantial coincidences already found. To turn rumors and circumstantial evidence into a legal basis for action, the police had to go through a clear legal procedure. In the U.S. theory, this is quite strict. Even if neighbors name a surname, even if suspicions seem obvious, a search warrant is needed. Without it, any evidence found will not have legal force. Therefore, county detectives began assembling a packet of documents. It included everything they already had: repeated testimonies from neighbors who mentioned the Lewis family, information that Ryan was seen near locations where minor incidents occurred, such as missing animals and a dumpster fire, plus the matching size of the shoe print recorded near Harris's house. This set of facts was sufficient for the prosecutor to support the petition and present the materials to the judge. The Cleveland County Court reviewed the request on an expedited basis. Such cases require promptness. There is a risk that evidence will be destroyed or moved. Ultimately, the document was signed, and the next morning, the investigative team went to the Lewis family's address. The visit began officially. Police officers presented the warrant, recorded the time of arrival, and proceeded with the standard procedure. To outside observers, everything seemed mundane. Cars stood in the complex's yard. Neighbors went about their business. But it was at this moment that something was happening that would determine the further direction of the investigation. A search is always conducted according to a well-established algorithm. First, common areas. The living room, kitchen, garage are checked. In the Lewis home, everything looked quite typical. Furniture, appliances, nothing suspicious. But operatives knew that key findings are most often hidden in personal rooms. That's why attention focused on Ryan's bedroom. Visually, it was an ordinary teenage room. Books, textbooks, a computer, a few scattered items. However, the protocol requires not relying on first impressions. Every shelf, every drawer is checked and documented. When officers reached the closet, their eyes were immediately drawn to a dark backpack placed on the bottom shelf. The item looked ordinary, but its placement seemed strange. It was neatly hidden, as if deliberately put away from sight. According to instructions, the backpack was placed on the table, photographed, and opened in the presence of witnesses. Inside were familiar items, notebooks, pencils, a few small things. But among them was a small bundle wrapped in fabric. Unwrapping the fabric, the police saw a piece of jewelry, a thin chain with a pendant. The report noted the item was feminine, with clear signs of wear. This was not a new item from a store. The metal had darkened, and the pendant had characteristic scratches that only appear after years of use. Officers immediately understood that such a find could not be explained by chance. Further actions were strictly regulated. The chain was seized, packaged in a separate bag, and entered into the protocol. But merely seizing the item is not enough. To turn the item into evidence, its ownership must be confirmed. For this, the investigation invited the deceased woman's daughter. The procedure was official. In a separate room, in the presence of witnesses and a lawyer, the young woman was shown the jewelry. She identified it without hesitation. The chain belonged to her mother, and she wore it almost every day. The protocol recorded, identification carried out, ownership confirmed by relative. From this moment, the chain ceased to be just a discovery. Now, it was an item that directly linked the Lewis family home to the victim. Such an item cannot be explained by coincidence. This is not a shoe that many people might have in common. This is a personal item with a specific owner, and it was found hidden in the boy's room. Thus, the investigation took a sharp leap forward. From indirect hints and conversations, the investigation moved to tangible evidence. And it was this that changed the course of the case. From this point on, the police had to focus on establishing how the ornament ended up with Ryan and what role he played in the events of October. When the investigation yields its first clues, it is always perceived as a major breakthrough. But in reality, any finding, be it an item, a fingerprint, or a shoe print, has no legal force on its own. Assumptions can be voiced during interrogation, but they do not work in court. Only facts confirmed by expert examinations are accepted there. That is why, after the search and seizure of items, specialists did what is always done in such cases. They drew up reports, meticulously documented each piece of evidence, and sent them for laboratory analysis. This is a standard procedure, but it is precisely what allows the story to move from the realm of conjecture to the sphere of proven facts. The chain with the pendant found in the backpack was sent to the genetic forensics department. Before beginning work, criminologists took a series of photographs of the item from different angles, recorded its condition in the protocol, and even mentioned minor scratches and dirt. Then the ornament was placed in a sterile bag, and only after that did specialists proceed to collect samples. For this, cotton swabs were used to collect microscopic particles from the surface of the pendant and chain link. In the laboratory, such samples go through a complex process of DNA extraction. The method allows for finding genetic material even when it is extremely scarce. In this case, experts found traces of epithelial cells, skin residues invisible to the naked eye, on the chain. They compared them with control samples taken in advance from relatives. The match was complete. The DNA profile belonged to Sophia Harris. This meant that the item had indeed been with her shortly before the incident. The conclusion's wording was clear. The item was in direct contact with the victim. For the investigation, this became the first solid proof of Ryan's room's connection to the victim. In parallel, work was carried out on another key physical find: sneakers. Their soles were photographed, three-dimensional casts were made, and they were entered into an electronic database. The main task of the experts was to compare them with the print found near the Harris home. Visual comparison yielded the first matches: size, tread pattern, and depth of the design. But to definitively confirm the result, specialists use computer image overlay programs. Every detail matters here. Even if two pairs of shoes are of the same model and size, each gradually acquires individual defects, cracks, chips, uneven wear. In this case, experts identified several unique features: wear on the right heel, a chip on the edge of the tread, and a characteristic arc-shaped mark. All these elements were present on both the sole of the sneakers and the photograph of the print from the crime scene. The match was so precise that experts ruled out the possibility of error. The protocol included the wording, "The print was left by a specific pair of shoes seized from Ryan Lewis." Thus, the investigation obtained two weighty arguments. First, the chain, identified by the victim's daughter, was confirmed by DNA analysis and indisputably belonged to Sophia. Second, the shoe print near her house matched the sneakers found with the suspect. Together, these facts formed a coherent system where neighbors' words and rumors of strange behavior no longer held decisive significance. Now, the police had a set of scientific evidence that could not be attributed to coincidence. These results changed the course of the case. If previously the focus was on different versions, from family conflict to the nephew's mercenary motive after the examinations, the focus shifted definitively. Now, the task of the investigation was not to find a suspect, but to reconstruct the picture of events. How exactly he acted when he was near the Harris house, and what happened afterward. This stage of the investigation would be the next step. When the examination solidified the evidence in official documents and the investigation acquired a serious factual basis, a new stage began, working with the suspect's immediate circle. This time, attention shifted entirely to Ryan's parents. They were summoned to the station not as accused, but as witnesses, to provide explanations regarding the found items. But even this status was difficult for them. From the very beginning, they perceived the mere fact of suspicion as a personal tragedy, and tried with all their might to show that it was some kind of mistake. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was tense. The parents entered together, visibly anxious, but also with an inner readiness to defend their son. They did not have the opportunity to devise a complex strategy, so their answers were emotional but predictable. First, they tried to explain the discovery, the chain found in the backpack. According to their version, Ryan could have simply found it on the street or somewhere near the school. He often brings home things that are lying on the road. It's a common childhood habit, the mother explained. This version sounded like an attempt to reclassify serious evidence as a mundane accident. The conversation then moved to the shoe print. Here, the parents emphasized its commonality and standardness. According to them, many teenagers in the area have similar sneakers, and it would be a mistake to conclude involvement based solely on one model. They repeated this thought several times, trying to emphasize that coincidence is possible and lacks probative force. All these words were entered into the protocol. For the investigation, such explanations are common. At this stage, parents often try to find any arguments, even the weakest, to deflect suspicion from their child. It is important to note that formally their testimony is considered, but its true value is gained only after comparison with facts. And the facts collected by criminologists at that moment already looked far more convincing than words. The results of the examinations undermined the family's defense. The chain contained Sophia's DNA. This meant it could not have been found long before the incident or accidentally picked up on the street. The ornament's contact with its owner was direct and confirmed. As for the shoes, experts presented a full report. The digital overlay of the print recorded at the crime scene onto the impressions of Ryan's sneaker soles matched a number of unique features. The wear on the heel, characteristic cracks, and beveling of the sole fully corresponded to the print. Such a level of coincidence rules out accident. Ultimately, the investigation reached an unambiguous conclusion. The parents' explanations are subjective and do not withstand scrutiny in light of scientific data. Their words were officially deemed unconvincing, and the version of an accidental find or the commonality of the shoes was rejected as untenable. The attempt to deflect attention from the key evidence yielded no results. On the contrary, their stance only reinforced the impression that the family was trying by all means to shield Ryan from the investigation, even when the facts pointed in the opposite direction. For the investigation, this became another confirmation. The defense line was built on emotions, not on reality. Thus, this stage of the case concluded with the parents formally remaining witnesses, but their arguments lost weight. The investigation, however, took a step further. Now the focus shifted exclusively to Ryan himself and his possible involvement. Ahead was a stage where every new fact would become part of a complete picture emerging around the main person of interest. When the operatives were finishing the search of the Lewis family home, many of them already believed that the most important evidence had been collected. Items were packed, the report almost complete. But it is precisely at such moments, when it seems that everything is already known, that discoveries occur that fundamentally change the course of the case. On the top shelf in the suspect's room was a stack of notebooks and school materials. Among them, one stood out a thick cover, scratched but neatly closed with an elastic band. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary notebook for homework or notes. But it only took opening a few pages to realize. Before the police was not just a notebook, but a potential key to solving the entire case. It turned out to be a personal diary. Such findings always hold special weight for criminologists. Unlike material evidence, such as a chain or shoes, a diary can reveal a person's motives and internal state, showing what was going through their mind in the period before the events. Therefore, the document was immediately seized, sealed, and sent to the laboratory for analysis. Already at this stage, detectives understood. It was here that they could find an explanation for what had remained in the shadows until now. The contents of the notebook turned out to be far more disturbing than anyone expected. The first pages looked quite neutral. There were to-do lists, short entries like, "check vacant lot," "observe in the evening." But the further experts progressed through the dates, the more questions arose. The entries included descriptions of experiments, diagrams with designated yards, arrows indicating routes, and times when it was best to leave the house. The specialist's particular attention was drawn to the coincidences between the dates of the entries and events in the area. For example, in May, strange notes were recorded that coincided with neighbors' complaints about missing pets. In July, a drawing of a trash container with the inscription "Fire" appeared in the diary. It was at this time that a fire was recorded on the site next to the house, where charred remains of toys were later found. And in October, a few days before the attack on the neighbor, plans appeared in the entries, where houses and entrances, including the Harris address, were marked on a diagram. Experts noted that these entries showed escalation. If initially it was about observations and seemingly harmless actions, over time the notes became more detailed and disturbing. The diary not only recorded thoughts but created a sense of preparation and planning. This could not be explained by accidental interest or fantasy. Everything looked systematic, step by step. Some pages were particularly revealing. There one could see diagrams of the vacant lot behind Norman Middle School with marked points and arrows. It was there, months later, that police found animal remains. Such a coincidence seemed too precise to be accidental. For the investigation, this meant that the diary not only reflected the suspect's thoughts, but was also directly connected to real events. After studying the contents, the investigation had no doubts. This notebook constituted full-fledged evidence, but for it to have legal force, authorship had to be confirmed. For this, a handwriting examination was appointed. Specialists compared the entries from the diary with the handwriting in Ryan Lewis's school notebooks and official documents. The examination included an analysis of letter slant, characteristic errors, and pressure on the paper. The result was unambiguous. The author of the diary and the suspect were one and the same person. This fact changed the perception of the entire story. Until this moment, parents could claim that the found items came to their son by chance, that the chain could have been picked up on the street, and the shoes could have matched someone else's. But the diary could not be explained in such a way. It reflected an inner world, his own entries, his personal observations and actions. This evidence ruled out any talk of accident. Thus, the version that the incident could have been a random confluence of circumstances finally collapsed. The diary showed that a system lay behind the entire chain of events. There was planning, intentions, and steps that followed one after another. For the investigation, this meant a new stage. Now it was not just about coincidences, but about direct evidence of intent. This discovery made the person of interest the main focus of the investigation. The investigation had to delve into the details. What exactly he planned, what events were reflected in the entries, and how they were connected to the tragedy. The diary became the decisive piece of evidence that changed the course of the case and pushed the police to construct a complete picture of what happened. When an investigation brings all the evidence together, an unavoidable moment arrives. At a certain stage of the investigation, the person of interest can no longer be left out. They must be presented with the facts and their reaction heard. This is exactly what happened here. A formal interrogation was scheduled, all in strict accordance with procedure, in a specially equipped room, under recording, in the presence of a lawyer and an invited specialist psychologist. This formality was necessary because not just an investigation, but the fate of a person, albeit a very young one, was at stake. The interrogation began calmly. The detective leading the case initially used a standard protocol: identification, recording of rights, explanation that the conversation was part of a criminal investigation. But all this was merely an introduction, preparation for the main part. Soon specific questions followed. First, neutral ones. Where he was at a certain time, what he was doing, whom he was in contact with. The suspect answered monosyllabically, without details, often averting his gaze. This already stood out. Not emotional outbursts, not protest, but precisely closed-offness and detachment. Then the detective moved to the evidence. First, the conversation turned to the shoe print found at the crime scene. The investigators placed a photo exhibit on the table with an overlay of the sole print and photographs of the sneakers seized from the house. The match was obvious. The reaction to what was presented. An absence of any emotion. No surprise, no indignation, no attempt to explain. Only a quiet, "I don't know," after which the suspect withdrew into himself even more. Next came the next step, the demonstration of the chain with the pendant. This item had a direct connection to the victim, and its presence in the suspect's backpack was a key point. The detective announced the results of the DNA analysis, confirming the ornament's ownership. But even to this, the person of interest gave no convincing reaction. He did not deny it, he did not invent excuses. Just a dry statement. "I found it." But to clarifying questions about where and when, no answers followed. The most difficult moment was the conversation about the diary. Experts prepared copies of pages with characteristic diagrams and entries. The detective showed them one by one, pointing out the coincidences of dates with events in the area. This moment can be called the culmination of the interrogation. In any other situation, a person would defend themselves, seek explanations, try to deny. But in this case, the reaction was the same: silence. The suspect sat motionless, gaze lowered, no emotional manifestations. For the investigators, this detachment seemed the most disturbing. The psychologist present at the interrogation noted in the protocol, "Emotional reaction is minimal. Detachment from the presented facts is observed." This was not like a simple denial of guilt. It seemed that the person of interest did not connect himself with the reality of what was happening at all. At the final stage of the interrogation, the detective asked a direct question: "Are you involved in the attack on Harris?" There was no answer, neither affirmative nor negative. The suspect chose to remain silent. Legally, this looked like an exercise of the right not to incriminate oneself. But for the investigation, this became another important point. The absence of a confession meant that the case would be built solely on physical evidence and expert examinations. Thus, this stage ended. The investigation did not get a confession, did not hear details from the suspect's mouth. But the police already had material evidence, expert conclusions, and the diary. All of this allowed them to move forward. Now the story moved to a new level. Ahead was the court, where precisely these facts, not words, would decide the outcome of the high-profile case. The diary found in the Lewis home was frightening in itself. It contained diagrams, notes, strange descriptions, and dates. But for a court, such material could be interpreted as fiction or fantasies. Lawyers perfectly understood that without confirmation by real facts, such entries risked remaining circumstantial. Therefore, investigators began to carefully examine each page and every detail. And on one of them, they discovered what changed the course of the investigation. The text mentioned a vacant lot near the school. The author wrote about a buried experiment and left a schematic description next to a lamppost. A little further, a pile of concrete slabs nearby a steep slope. These landmarks coincided with a place where teenagers in the area rarely, but still, went to hang out. Investigators understood. If the entries turned out to be true, it meant that this was not just a diary with fantasies, but a document recording real actions. An investigation team was formed, and permission for a site visit was obtained. Criminologists, police officers, and witnesses went to the site. Every movement was recorded on video and photo to rule out any doubts. The place turned out to be neglected: tall grass, empty bottles, a bonfire site that, apparently, had long been used by a group of teenagers. But the specialist's gaze immediately latched onto the coincidences. Indeed, there was an old pole, next to it a pile of concrete slabs, and a little further away, the trace of a bonfire. All of this matched the diary entries exactly. The excavations began cautiously. Shovels were used, but the top layer was removed by hand to avoid damaging potential objects. The soil was dense, but after just a few hours, the first discoveries appeared. At a depth of several tens of centimeters, hair and small bones were found. Remains of not one, but several animals were discovered. Everything was seized according to the rules, in bags, with labeling, with recording in the protocol. For the investigation, this was a serious moment. The diary entries began to be confirmed by physical evidence. After seizure, the findings were sent to the laboratory. Experts were tasked with conducting a full analysis from DNA to hair comparison. The investigation awaited the results with particular interest, as they were to conclusively determine the authenticity of the diary. Several weeks later, a report arrived. It stated that biological traces suitable for analysis were preserved in the found remains. The conducted DNA study established a match with the profile of a pet belonging to neighbors in the complex. This cat had been reported missing since May. The family had appealed on social media, put up flyers, but the search yielded no results. Now it became clear that its fate was linked to those very experiments described in the diary. This result was of key importance. It linked all lines of investigation: complaints about missing animals, diary entries, and actual findings. For the investigation, this was a definitive breakthrough. No abstract fantasy, no accidental find a direct connection between the words in the notebook and real events. From this moment, the diary ceased to be circumstantial evidence. It became full-fledged evidence, directly linked to the case. The investigators received a closed logical chain: text entries, specific location, excavations, biological examination, confirmed ownership of the findings by neighbors. Thus, the evidence came together into a system. Now, the investigation had not only a picture of the incident and collected testimonies, but also a material basis that linked the person of interest to a series of episodes. This breakthrough finally convinced the prosecution. The case could be sent to court. Everything required was already in the hands of the investigation. When the investigation reached the logical conclusion of its work, the moment arrived that all participants in the process had been waiting for. From operational steps and evidence verification, the case moved into the legal sphere. Now, every word in the protocols, every expert examination, and every document had to take the form of official charges. This was the boundary beyond which the investigation transformed into a court case. Before this, everything resembled a tense search for puzzle pieces. Now, the assembled picture had to be presented to prosecutors and, in the future, the court. In such cases, the prosecution acts as the final filter. It is here that it is checked whether the collected materials possess the legal strength that will withstand scrutiny in court. And so, after careful evaluation and comparison of facts, a fateful decision was made. The case was officially transferred to the prosecutor's office. This wording sounds dry and mundane, but behind it lies a huge amount of work, nerves, and efforts of dozens of people. The transfer of the case meant one thing. The investigators were confident that the evidentiary basis was not just weighty, but irrefutable. Based on these materials, indictments were drawn up. The documents looked severe and cold, devoid of superfluous emotions, but they reflected everything that the investigators had uncovered step by step. Ryan Lewis was charged with involuntary manslaughter, a key point that became the heart of the case. In addition, he was charged with animal cruelty, confirmed not only by witness testimonies, but also by the results of expert examinations of the remains found in the vacant lot. However, in this story, guilt was not limited to one person. Ryan's parents also came into the purview of the law. Their role was defined as criminal negligence. They knew about their son's strange behavior, about his interests related to aggression and cruel experiments, but preferred to turn a blind eye. Formally, they did nothing, but in fact, it was this inaction that allowed the tragic events to occur. The legal phrasing was extremely clear: failure to take measures to prevent dangerous behavior. This accusation became not only a legal, but also a moral verdict. Thus, each count of the indictment reflected different aspects of this story: Ryan's direct involvement, his preparation, and actions; the indirect, but extremely important responsibility of the parents. Together, they formed a single line of accusation that would now be heard within the walls of the court. And yet, the most shocking moment was not what charges were brought, but the reaction of the accused. Ryan did not plead guilty. Throughout the investigation, he maintained indifference, and at this moment, his behavior did not change. His parents also refused to admit negligence, stating that they could not have known and did not suspect the scale of what was happening. The formal words of defense sounded strained and weak, but it was this stance that became their line of conduct. This meant only one thing: the disclosure would not happen in the quiet of interrogation rooms and would not be accompanied by a confession. The true culmination awaited in the courtroom, where all the evidence, expert examinations, and witness testimonies would be placed on the scales of justice. And it was there that the fate of Ryan Lewis and his parents would finally be decided. When the investigation considered its work complete, the moment arrived that all parties to the process had been waiting for. The case materials were laid on the prosecutor's desk, and it was there, in the quiet of the prosecutor's offices, that a new stage began: the compilation of the official version of what had happened. This was not just a formal document. The reconstruction of events became the main tool by which the prosecution was to explain to the court and jury every piece of evidence, every action, and every conclusion made during the investigation. The main question was: how, according to the investigation and the prosecution, did events unfold on that fateful day? To construct this chain, prosecutors relied on everything: the results of forensic medical and criminalistic examinations, trace evidence data, analysis of diary entries, witness testimonies from neighbors, and confirmations from experts. Each puzzle piece fell into place, and ultimately, a consistent logical version emerged that left none of the case participants indifferent. The reconstruction itself was presented in a dry, polished form, devoid of emotion. This made it even more chilling. According to the prosecution's version, everything unfolded as follows. Ryan leaves his home that evening. He walks down the street. His route is recorded by the testimonies of several neighbors who saw the familiar, slender figure. He heads to where Sophia was. A brief contact occurs between them, and although no one could accurately convey the content of their conversation, the investigation claimed a conflict arose. Word by word, a flash of irritation. And it is at this moment that the blow is struck. The prosecution then pointed to a moment that became key. The ornament, which would later be found in the suspect's backpack, was removed from Sophia and appropriated by him. This found direct confirmation in expert examinations and the recognition of the personal item by the victim's close relatives. Every step in this reconstruction was based on evidence. The shoe print at the crime scene matched the sneakers seized during the search. The chain with the pendant was among his belongings. The diary found in his room described similar actions and indicated methodicalness. And the found animal remains in the vacant lot, confirmed by DNA analysis, completed the picture. The prosecution emphasized, only when these facts are put together do they make sense. Otherwise, they remain disparate pieces of a puzzle. Nevertheless, investigators honestly admitted gaps remained in the version. The weapon used to strike the blow had not yet been identified. It was found neither during the search nor near the crime scene. The exact words that triggered the conflict also remained unknown. These were moments that could not be reconstructed with complete certainty. And yet, lawyers emphasized, the presence of these white spots does not destroy the main construct. For the core of the case is not words, but material evidence that holds weight in court. Such a reconstruction, even with incomplete clarity, held power and significance. It allowed the prosecution to assert Ryan's actions were not accidental. They were structured in a specific sequence, and it was this that transformed him from a person of interest into the main accused. For the jury, This version was to be a picture painted not by emotions, but by facts, verified by laboratories and protocols. Ultimately, the reconstruction became a kind of watershed. From this moment, the story ceased to be solely a matter for investigators and criminologists. It entered the legal sphere. Now, all these materials, all examinations, and evidence had to be brought into the courtroom, where they would be considered openly in the public eye. The trial was to become an arena where the prosecution and defense would confront each other face to face, and the suspect's fate would be decided not by conjecture, but by that very chain of evidence, collected step by step. The culmination of this case came when the investigation was completed and all materials were transferred to the courtroom. At this stage, the story finally ceased to be merely a series of protocols, expert analyses, and testimonies. Everything that the investigators had painstakingly gathered had to pass through one last check, a trial where both the prosecution and the defense had their say. It was there that the fate of Ryan Lewis and his parents was decided, and it was there that the final answer everyone following this story awaited was formulated. The hearings began in the District Court of Norman. Prosecutors, lawyers, witnesses, and experts entered the courtroom. Journalists who managed to get inside noted an unusual atmosphere, both businesslike and extremely tense. Everyone understood that this was no ordinary case. The city, where serious crimes had been almost non-existent for decades, now became the stage for a high-profile proceeding that was discussed not only by neighbors, but also by residents of the entire district. The first stage of the hearings was dedicated to the presentation of the collected evidence. Prosecutors alternately read out search protocols, DNA expert analyses, and trace evidence reports. The jury was shown photographs of the found chain, the diary, and comparative images of shoe prints. Even excerpts from correspondence, which indirectly indicated Ryan's knowledge of certain circumstances known only to the investigation, were read out in the protocol. The atmosphere became increasingly heavy, and with each new detail, it became evident. Not only was there a lot of evidence, but it mutually confirmed one another. Then the experts testified. The court heard from forensic scientists, geneticists, and handwriting experts. Each specialist spoke in the dry language of science, but collectively their testimonies produced an astonishing impression. The handwriting expert confirmed the authorship of the diary. The geneticist reported a complete match of DNA on the jewelry with the victim's DNA. The trace evidence expert described unique defects in the sole of the sneakers that matched the prints at the crime scene. In this set of facts, there was no emotionality, only logic and figures. But it was precisely their strength that shattered any attempt by the defense to present the case as an accident or misunderstanding. When it was the defense's turn, Ryan's parents and lawyers tried to construct an alternative explanation. They argued that the found items could have come into his possession by chance, that the diary was more fantasies than real plans, and that the shoe match could have been an error. But all these arguments were broken by a rigid, almost mechanically clear chain of evidence. Prosecutors repeatedly emphasized too many coincidences, too many facts confirmed by independent expert examinations. Special attention was paid to the role of the parents. They were reminded of neighbors' complaints, strange findings, and the fact that they knew but took no action. The prosecution insisted their inaction and unwillingness to intervene became a key factor that allowed the tragic events to unfold. Thus, in the dock, there was essentially not just one figure, but the entire family. After all interrogations and debates, the moment of truth arrived. The court retired to make a decision. Usually this procedure takes a few hours, but this time the wait dragged on. Silence reigned in the hall. People exchanged glances, but no one dared to discuss aloud what was about to be announced. The atmosphere resembled a prolonged pause before the hammer strike, and everyone understood. A turning point was ahead. The verdict was read officially, without emotion, but its content proved to be crucial. Ryan Lewis was found guilty on all main counts of the indictment. The court classified his actions as involuntary manslaughter and confirmed the facts of animal cruelty. The parents were also found guilty. Their negligence and unwillingness to stop what was happening received legal assessment. Next followed the announcement of specific penalties. Ryan received a sentence until he reached adulthood in a closed facility for minors with mandatory participation in psychiatric programs. The parents were sentenced to a large fine and deprived of custody of their younger daughter. The court found that they had failed in their duties and should be held responsible for the consequences. These words marked the final point. The case was officially closed, and the materials were sent to the archive, but it was closed only legally. For the Lewis family, this decision became a stigma that would remain with them forever. For the neighbors, it was a reminder that even in a quiet and prosperous neighborhood, events can occur that shatter the usual sense of security. For the city, it became the most high-profile case in recent decades, a case that changed the perception of Norman's tranquility. The court put an end to the legal part of this story, but the consequences for all participants continued to live on. These are what become the next important stage, what goes beyond documents, but determines how people will live after this verdict. The verdict was announced, but that did not mean that life returned to its usual course. In fact, everything was just beginning. Every street, every yard, every corner of that neighborhood was forever marked by this story. People could no longer look at the neighboring houses in the same way as before. The former confidence and sense of security vanished, leaving caution and distrust in their place. The family, finding themselves at the center of the high-profile trial, could not withstand the pressure. Their home, once neat and well-maintained, suddenly became a reminder of what had happened. It seemed to lose its warmth, gaining a bad reputation. Their mailbox remained empty because neighbors avoided even minimal contact. No one wanted to rent them a home or help with everyday tasks. They had only one option left: to leave, and they left, leaving behind a void, and for the neighbors, a sense of relief and at the same time, anxiety. For with their departure, the possibility of observing the situation in any way also disappeared. The remaining residents drew conclusions. Cameras appeared in the yards, something no one had thought about before. Parents became more attentive to where and with whom their loved ones spent their time. Residents of streets who previously used to leave their doors unlocked began installing new locks, bars, and alarms. This was a kind of collective way to fight what had settled in their memory: fear. The local press continued to revisit the case for a long time. Newspapers printed new materials, television aired reports, and discussions did not subside in city cafes and barbershops. People argued. Some saw it as a tragedy caused by illness, others as a manifestation of cold and deliberate cruelty. But one thing united everyone. No one remained indifferent to this case. It became a symbol of how darkness can lurk in an ordinary, quiet life. The most agonizing question remained open: why? Expert examinations offered different versions. Some psychiatrists claimed that it was about severe mental disorders that inevitably pushed the defendant to such actions. Others insisted that there were no illnesses, that before them was a person capable of conscious choice and deliberately taking steps that sent shivers down one's spine. The entries found in the diary also gave no peace. There was a cold systemic nature there that was difficult to explain solely by a disorder. They revealed consistency, a plan, a rigid calculation. But at the same time, in some fragments, chaoticness appeared, as if the author's inner world was tearing apart. And in this lay the most terrifying uncertainty. No one could definitively decide what exactly drove him. In a legal sense, everything is perfectly clear. The guilty party is punished, the crime is solved, all evidence is built into a strong chain. But in a human, moral sense, there is no clarity. This case became a reminder that evil can be nearby, in the most ordinary house, behind the next door, and that we are not always able to fully understand its nature. This is precisely the legacy of that story. It left behind not only a court verdict and newspaper clippings, but also an unhealing question that gives no peace even years later. The guilty is condemned, the case is closed, but the explanation that could put an end to it has never been found. And so, this story continues to live in conversations, in memory, and in fear. It is like a shadow that remains even when the light goes out. On April 28th, 2024, at 10 o'clock and 3 minutes in the morning, a call was made to 911. A woman reported that while walking through the forest, she and her friends stumbled upon a strange find. In dense bushes, far from usual littering spots, they saw several large bags. This immediately raised their suspicion. The bags were lying as if someone had intentionally left them there. Without losing time, the group called the police. When the first law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they were met not just by a pile of trash. The bags, as expected, were filled with something that clearly had no relation to ordinary garbage. Initially, the police thought it might be remnants of something discarded without due care, but soon, after opening them, the picture changed. Inside the bags were human body parts. Everything was packed with unimaginable neatness, as if someone had purposefully tried to hide traces and maximally conceal their actions. This was not an accidental find. It became obvious that they were dealing with a crime that required special attention. The police immediately understood that this was not a random crime or a spontaneous act. Suspicions grew, as did the questions. Whose remains were these? And who could have disposed of them so meticulously? What was the motive, and what did all this mean? Examining the details, specialists noted that the dismemberment was performed with surgical precision. The unusual neatness immediately made it clear that this was not an ordinary crime, but a case that required a deeper approach. This was not a person who accidentally found themselves in a situation requiring brutal measures. This was someone who knew what they were doing. But who was this person, and why did they do everything exactly this way? There were no answers to these questions yet, and it was from this moment that the investigation entered a new, more complex stage. 6 weeks before the tragic discovery, in a suburb of Portland, everything was as usual. In one of the calmest and most beautiful neighborhoods, where houses stood a decent distance from each other, and the lawns were always perfectly mowed, the Miller family was an example to all. The spacious house on Iron Mountain, BLVD, was the ornament of the street, and there was no place for upheavals in their lives. David, a successful dentist with a reputation as one of the best specialists in the city, was always in the spotlight. His clients were people who could be called the top of local society. He was someone who knew how to talk and earn trust. His wife, Sharon, dedicated herself entirely to the family, taking care of the house, keeping things in order, and a kitchen that always smelled of fresh pies, a lifestyle that captivated, an ideal couple, an ideal family. Everything, just like in a textbook. Neighbors couldn't help but talk about how wonderfully they lived. It was almost an advertisement. Come in, and you would see a picture of a calm and prosperous existence. The ideal family, everyone who had ever met them on the street said about the Millers. It seemed all their quarrels and problems remained behind closed doors. Behind their facade was a strong and successful family, which, everyone thought, could not face something so terrible and inexplicable. But if someone had looked closer into their home, they would have seen that the ideal picture does not always reflect reality. At the center of this family was Olivia, 17 years old, the pride of her parents, a winner of music competitions, dreaming of a future at Juilliard. She was the one on whom they placed all their hopes. Olivia was not just a talented girl, she was the embodiment of the success her parents had so eagerly awaited. With her music, her perseverance, her huge dream, to become part of one of the most prestigious music academies in the world. Every one of her performances was a step towards a bright future. She played the violin with such passion that every chord seemed to be the execution, not just of a melody, but of an entire destiny. For Sharon and David, this was not just a daughter. It was a project. It was a goal for which they lived and worked. She had to enter Juilliard. She had to become a famous violinist. Everything in Olivia's life was supposed to lead her to this. And so, on March 12th, 2024, what they had been waiting for happened, a letter from New York. At first glance, it was an ordinary letter, but for Olivia, it meant much more. It came with the emblem of one of the most famous educational institutions in the world. Sharon barely restrained her emotions when she opened the envelope. And when she read that her daughter had been accepted into Juilliard, at that moment, it seemed that the Miller family's dream had come true. Everything was going according to plan. They had reached the peak they had so strived for. For Olivia, it was a triumph, the culmination of her efforts and work, her long-awaited recognition. But for her, it was not just a victory. It was the beginning of something more. For Sharon, it was a moment of pride, but at the same time, a terrible realization. Her daughter was ready to leave home, go to another city, start a new life, which meant their world could be destroyed. This was the beginning of a big break. For the mother, it meant not only success, but also loss. The loss of control, the loss of the bond she had so carefully built over all these years. Olivia's success became a starting point for something greater. A clash of two worlds, one full of hopes and plans, and another in which there was no room for disappointment. The dream of Juilliard became not only a success, but also a catalyst for changes that could no longer be reversed. That day, March 12th, was key. It was an event that put an end to something, but opened the doors to something terrible, and what would happen next would become known a little later. On March 16, 2024, the day after Olivia was supposed to return home, her mother, Sharon, called 911. Her voice conveyed worry, but also a strange calmness, as if she herself hadn't yet realized what had happened. "My daughter hasn't come home," she said when reporting the disappearance. For any mother, this might have been just an alarming sign, but for Sharon, this call became the beginning of something much more terrifying. The police immediately dispatched a patrol to investigate. Formally, it was a usual missing person case, a typical call that comes to the police every week. However, already at this stage, the investigation began to notice something strange. Olivia had not returned home, but her disappearance did not seem accidental. Outwardly, everything looked like a typical teenage quarrel, but the initial version of events soon began to unravel. Why did her mother not show much agitation? Why did Sharon's words sound so even, without hysteria, without what would be characteristic of a parent in such a situation? The police immediately went to the Miller's house to conduct an initial inspection, and this is where the first contradictions began. Olivia's room looked almost empty. At first glance, it seemed she had simply left, but the details didn't match. The bed was unmade, which could mean the girl wasn't planning to stay. The window was open, as if she could have gone out through it. However, despite this, all her belongings were in place. The violin, which always stood in the corner of the room, textbooks, a computer, everything remained untouched. These contradictions stumped the investigators. The window was open, so possibly an escape, but all her belongings were in place, so she wasn't planning to leave. All this created tension in the investigation, and the police began to look for possible explanations. Sharon, oddly enough, was convinced that her boyfriend Caleb was involved in her daughter's disappearance. He was the last one to see Olivia before she vanished. There had recently been a conflict between them, and even stranger was the fact that Caleb himself, it turned out, hadn't given a clear answer to the question of where he was that night. All this made Sharon confident of his guilt. For her, it seemed, there were no other options. The mother's words became the main reason for further steps in the investigation. Based on her testimony, the police focused on Caleb. Everything indicated that the conflict with him could have been the reason for Olivia's disappearance. There was no evidence, but the motivation was clear. Investigators concentrated on the boyfriend as the main suspect. The police issued a warrant for Caleb's interrogation, and now this young man became the main object of attention. Thus, the investigation proceeded along a predetermined path. Evidence was not yet at hand, but the hypothesis about Caleb seemed logical. However, this was only the first step. Next, the investigation had to figure out how plausible these accusations were and what the case would actually end up being. When Caleb was brought to the station for questioning, his behavior immediately attracted attention. He was nervous. This was not uncommon for someone in such a situation, but something about his demeanor raised doubts. He couldn't sit still, constantly adjusted his clothes, his hands often twitched, as if he was trying to hide something he couldn't explain. All of this was recorded in the protocol, and his every word seemed increasingly incoherent. When detectives started asking questions, his answers became less confident, and to some, he couldn't give a clear response at all. This was no longer just nervousness, but a clear desire to hide something important. Caleb confirmed that there had indeed been a quarrel between him and Olivia, but he claimed it was an ordinary conflict, as happens in relationships. He stated that he hadn't seen her since the day they argued, but if it were that simple, why was he so nervous? Why didn't his behavior match that of someone who was truly innocent and merely worried about his girlfriend's disappearance? These questions remained unanswered. When detectives began to delve into details, one of them asked what they had last messaged about with Olivia. To this question, Caleb answered evasively, "I don't remember exactly." His attempt to avoid a direct answer seemed suspicious. Usually, people with nothing to hide can easily recall the content of their last correspondence. But Caleb found it difficult to even provide a general summary of their conversations. This added another element to his already strange behavior. The more his answers deviated from logic, the stronger the suspicion in the investigation became. After his evasive answers, detectives decided to check his phone, and that's when a crucial detail emerged. The correspondence with Olivia had been completely deleted. Not just individual messages, but the entire history of their communication had vanished. Caleb tried to explain this as a technical glitch or an accidental error, but the fact remained. It was a deliberate step to destroy information. Such an act could indicate that a person was trying to hide important evidence that could change the course of the investigation. The deletion of messages became weighty evidence. This action left no doubt that Caleb was trying to hide something. It was important to understand that he could have easily saved this data if there were no reasons to erase it. After all, the messages could have helped clarify what really happened that day and why Olivia didn't return home. Deleting such data looked like an attempt to destroy traces and prevent the police from finding out the truth. The investigation could not ignore this fact. The deletion of correspondence became a clear sign that Caleb was not just nervous and upset, but might have some connection to Olivia's disappearance. After this, the investigators had no doubts. He was the prime suspect. He had a motive, an argument with Olivia, and now he was destroying evidence, which also constituted an aggravating circumstance. All this indicated that Caleb was involved in the events that led to Olivia's disappearance. The investigation's decision was obvious. After checking his phone and analyzing his behavior, Caleb became the main and only suspect. His actions, nervousness, and attempts to conceal information left no doubt. The police had no other suspects, and now the investigation's task was to gather enough evidence for an indictment. All that remained was to find out what happened to Olivia and how Caleb was connected to her disappearance. But for now, all information pointed only to him. The question facing the investigation was simple, yet crucial. Where was Caleb on the night Olivia disappeared? For the police, the absence of an alibi is almost a conviction, and this fact was critically important for the investigation. To prove his innocence, the suspect needed to present irrefutable evidence that he could not have been at the crime scene. In Caleb's case, there was no such evidence. When asked where he was that night, he replied that he was home alone, playing video games. At first, this seemed plausible. Many people, especially young ones, often spend nights alone gaming. But here's the problem. Caleb couldn't provide witnesses who could confirm his words. He was alone, and that in itself created a vulnerability. The alibi was weak, and without witnesses, his claims could not be verified. The investigation understood that it faced a problem. Without proof of his innocence, Caleb remained the prime suspect. The police decided to verify his words using phone billing data. This is standard practice when an alibi is not confirmed by other means. A phone, as a data source, could provide information that would either confirm his words or prove them false. The data from the mobile operator was sufficient to show where the phone was at the time of Caleb's alleged night activity. The results were interesting. The phone was indeed in the vicinity of his home that evening. This confirmed his statement that he had not left the area. It seemed Caleb could justify himself, a piece of evidence that, at first glance, spoke in his favor, regardless of everything else. But there was one nuance that no one could ignore. The problem was that the phone's location data said nothing about Caleb actually being at home. He could simply have left his phone in one place and been somewhere else himself at that time. This created serious doubt about the reliability of the data. The fact that the phone was near the house did not prove that Caleb had not left its premises. Thus, the phone's location information did not clarify any of the important details. It did not resolve the key question. Was Caleb actually at home, or did he merely leave his phone in place while he himself left the house? The tension continued to mount. The investigation could not rely on this information as proof of innocence, and it seemed to have returned to the same dead end from which it began. That is why the investigation continued in search of other evidence. If Caleb's alibi could not be confirmed or refuted, then investigators had to look for other ways to obtain information. Obviously, the phone data did not provide the necessary answers, but perhaps other digital traces could help clarify the picture. A decision was made. The investigation issued a warrant for the seizure of all his digital devices for a deeper analysis. This meant that the police intended to check not only his phone, but also computers, gaming consoles, and any other devices that might contain important clues. This step was the investigation's last hope. If Caleb's digital devices contained hidden evidence that could shed light on the events of that night, then the police now had a chance to find them. But at this moment, the investigation entered a waiting phase. Now, all that remained was to hope for the results of the examination. Caleb continued to remain under suspicion. Despite the lack of direct evidence, his behavior, weak alibi, and unconvincing explanations continued to raise doubts. While experts analyzed his devices, the case made no progress. Time passed, and the investigation found itself in a difficult position, as no one knew what was hidden in Caleb's digital traces and what discovery they might lead to. The process of DNA laboratory analysis continued for several days, but when the results finally arrived at the police station, the tension in the air could be cut with a knife. It had long been clear that the discovered remains could not belong to someone random. They were meticulously hidden, dismembered with such precision that they could hardly have been the result of a random or spontaneous act. But whose remains were these? The answer everyone had been waiting for came in the form of an official conclusion. The police proceeded to cross-reference the DNA with samples taken from Olivia's parents. This process was standard procedure, but for all involved in the investigation, it meant something more, a moment that could finally confirm or refute all previous conjectures. With each passing hour, the anticipation became more unbearable. There was no doubt. Everything now depended on whether the genetic samples would match. When the lab results were obtained, they confirmed the worst. 100% match. The remains found in the forest belonged to Olivia Miller. For the police, this was a moment of truth, and for her family, an incredible tragedy. The victim's name became known, and this made the case even more personal than ever. The disappearance was no longer a mystery. Now the investigation took a completely different turn. With the official confirmation of the victim's identity, the case was reclassified from missing person to homicide. This meant that the investigation could move to a completely new stage, a more serious one, with much greater consequences. The status of the investigation changed, and with that came new pressure. Now it was necessary not just to find a missing person, but to find out who committed the murder and why. Detectives began to thoroughly review all materials related to previous investigations, and with the new information, they started analyzing the coroner's report. Every detail was important. And now, knowing that the found remains indeed belonged to Olivia, investigators returned to the already familiar data to study it from a different angle. They carefully examined the details of the dismemberment. All of it seemed too professional, too cold and calculated to be accidental. As it turned out, the body was not just hidden, it was dismembered with a precision usually expected from someone with certain skills. This was not random violence, it was something far more sinister. And then, detectives noticed one key detail that they previously couldn't quite appreciate. At the time of the first inspection, it didn't seem significant, but now everything changed. The dismemberment was performed with professional precision. It wasn't just violence, but specifically surgical dismemberment. Such skill, such calmness in dismembering. This is not the behavior of an impulsive teenager, as initially presumed by the investigation. This could only be the work of a very experienced person, possibly with medical training. Too many questions arose around this detail to simply ignore it. This information does not align with Caleb's profile. The boy, whom everyone thought could be the cause of the disappearance, was neither calm nor professional in such matters. He was young, impulsive, jealous. His reaction to what happened, his nervousness, and evasive answers could not reconcile with the level of cold-bloodedness demonstrated in the dismemberment. So, could an ordinary teenager like Caleb commit such an act? More and more people began to doubt the plausibility of this version. Now the investigation faced a new contradiction. The killer's profile, based on their actions, did not match the suspect's profile. Caleb might be emotional and even hot-tempered, but he was clearly not the kind of person who could so coldly and professionally dispose of a body. This detail cast doubt on the entire current version of the investigation. For the first time in the entire investigation, the version that Caleb was guilty began to crack. The investigation had to reconsider all its conclusions and look for new versions that could explain what happened to Olivia. Thus, the new discovery called into question the entire line of investigation, forcing detectives to seek new avenues and theories. And this was just the beginning of a new stage in the investigation. After the tragedy became officially known, Sharon Miller actively began giving interviews, participating in media appearances. To most viewers, her behavior seemed quite normal for a parent trying to find answers and justice after a loss. It was the behavior of someone genuinely suffering, without significant deviations from how one typically acts in such situations. In her eyes, one could see pain, and her words sounded like a cry for help. She appeared before cameras, demanding justice and hoping that someone would bring long-awaited answers about what happened to her daughter. However, one of the detectives who meticulously followed the entire process noticed something strange. He described her behavior as theatrical. It wasn't overt falseness, but small details created the impression that Sharon's emotions were amplified for the public. She was undoubtedly suffering, but there was something unnatural in her reaction that didn't correspond to the depth of the tragedy. Things like her manner of speaking or sudden changes in intonation made the detective wary. This wasn't necessarily proof of guilt, but it became a reason for further contemplation. The question that now arose for investigators was, how much of her grief was genuine and not a performance for the public? Was she trying to create a desired image for the camera to evoke more sympathy and divert attention from possible hidden motives? This question became key to the new stage of the investigation, and now all her actions, even the smallest, were subjected to scrutiny. Every gesture, every word was now evaluated from the perspective of what might be hidden beneath this outward display of sorrow. The investigation did not overlook Sharon's televised addresses made even before it was known that Olivia's body had been identified. These recordings were meticulously reviewed, and this was necessary to understand how a mother might behave in a moment of uncertainty. It was not merely an analysis of her words, but a genuine investigation into her behavior and reactions. The police began to study her speech, looking for the slightest inconsistencies, and then, one strange detail caught the investigators' attention. In her addresses, Sharon several times used the past tense when speaking of her daughter. She was. This was absolutely uncharacteristic for someone who still hopes that their loved one will return alive. In such situations, people typically speak of missing persons in the present tense. She will return. I am waiting for her. But Sharon spoke as if she knew her daughter would not return. This small linguistic marker became a serious red flag for the investigation. Such a choice of tense could indicate that Sharon had already accepted the tragic fact, despite the lack of official confirmation. Such a trifle, which most might simply overlook, became an important element of the investigation. In essence, her behavior, her words, and her manner of expressing thoughts did not align with the behavior of someone who had just experienced the disappearance of a loved one. It did not correspond to how a mother, hoping for the best, would normally behave. This moment forced the investigation to reconsider its attitude toward Sharon. Now, her actions began to appear in a different light. The official conclusion from the investigation protocols was clear. Her behavior did not correspond to how a parent experiencing the disappearance of their child should behave. This was a serious signal for the detectives, and they decided to move forward, checking her identity and past. And so, the investigation, which until recently had focused on Caleb, took a new direction. The attention of the investigation was now shifted to Sharon. Her life, her actions, her connections now had to be scrutinized. Indeed, if before she was merely a grieving mother, now she had become a person of interest to the investigation. The moment the police decided to delve into her personal history, she was no longer just a victim, but a potential suspect. Concurrently, the investigation did not forget about the main suspect, Caleb. For now, the investigation proceeded in two directions. Officially, the search for a killer with specific skills, and unofficially, the verification of Sharon. All this created many questions. Who was actually behind Olivia's disappearance, Sharon or Caleb? A new stage of the investigation was at the threshold, and the answers were still not found. When experts completed the analysis of Caleb's computer and gaming console, the investigation was ready for a crucial answer. For several weeks, police had eagerly awaited what this examination would reveal, as it was supposed to either definitively confirm Caleb's guilt or dispel all suspicions. The task was not easy. To find at least one detail that could confirm his involvement in what happened, the results were obtained, and they immediately became an important milestone in the investigation. The first significant finding was the recovered correspondence between Caleb and Olivia. Before starting the analysis, everyone expected this correspondence to be full of threats and conflicts that could have served as a motive for the crime. But the reality turned out to be quite different. The recovered messages showed only an ordinary teenage quarrel, nothing more. There was nothing in the correspondence that could indicate a possible death threat or an intention to kill someone. It all came down to a simple misunderstanding that could have easily been resolved peacefully. So, strangely enough, this ruled out one of the main theories about a possible motive. Now, the question of motive was closed. Caleb was not the person who could have committed a crime because of this quarrel. However, the main question that remained was his alibi. He still could not explain where he was at the moment all this happened. Doubts did not disappear, and the investigation had to move forward to answer this question. Consequently, experts began checking the activity logs of Caleb's gaming console, knowing that any information about his actions could be crucial. This data could provide clear and undeniable proof of where he was at the moment of Olivia's disappearance. Server logs, unlike words, cannot lie. In fact, this check was a real chance to uncover the whole picture. When the experts reviewed the analysis results, they found an important entry that put everything in its place. At the moment of Caleb's alleged activity, when everything was happening with Olivia, continuous network activity of his account was recorded. This entry remained unchanged for several hours, indicating that he was at home and playing video games. The logs confirmed that at this time, he could not have been anywhere else but in his house. This fact became decisive. Now, with 100% certainty, it could be said that Caleb physically could not have been near Olivia at the moment of her disappearance. He was at home, and his alibi was confirmed by technical data. Caleb, therefore, was not involved in the crime. With this discovery, the investigation took a sharp turn. The entire trail that led to Caleb was now completely closed. All suspicions that had accumulated over the previous weeks turned out to be false. He was acquitted, and all charges were dropped against him. This was a heavy blow for the investigation. They had spent weeks checking every little detail, while the main suspect may not even have been near the crime scene. Mistakes were made, and time was spent on a false trail. And now, the investigation faced a new problem. They did not have a single key lead to move forward. Thus, the case officially reached a dead end. Now the investigators had to start looking for answers from scratch again. But the question that remained became increasingly disturbing. If not Caleb, then who could be responsible for all this? And how would they now find the real killer? After Caleb was excluded from the suspects, the investigation reached a dead end. All leads that seemed promising led nowhere, and the only clue that remained was the coroner's report. This was the last document that recorded the most important details. For the investigation, this became a kind of restart, because they were returning to facts that could provide new answers. The phrase that had been at the heart of the investigation all this time, surgical precision, was again in the spotlight. The details of the dismemberment that the coroner noted in his report now acquired much greater weight. With each passing day, the investigation became more and more convinced that these actions could not have been accidental. Someone with certain skills must have been behind this. And this fact again brought investigators back to the question: which of the close relatives could have done this? The first candidate was Olivia's father, David Miller. He was the only man in the family circle who had not yet been properly checked. His profession, dentist, immediately attracted attention. After all, a person with such a profession, one way or another, must have been familiar with anatomy and perhaps possessed the necessary skills to dismember a body with such precision. This turned out to be a fairly logical hypothesis, and the investigation decided to delve into checking his alibi. David's alibi was checked immediately, and it looked very convincing. He was at a conference in another state on the night the crime occurred. Many people could confirm his presence. At that time, it seemed that all questions about David were dropped. However, the investigation could not simply close this question without checking everything to the end. Hotel bills, CCTV footage, and witness testimonies were requested. All this confirmed his alibi. He could not have been at the crime scene at that moment. The evidence turned out to be undeniable. Every aspect of his alibi was confirmed, and for the investigation, this question was officially closed. David Miller was completely excluded from the circle of suspects. This was a great disappointment for the investigators, as they were almost sure that everything would point to him. This was another confirmation that their intuition and logic were failing them. But what now? All possible candidates had been checked and excluded. Suspicions concerned only those who were in the close circle. The investigation lost precious time checking incorrect versions. It seemed that they had come to a wall. The only option was to confess the criminal, but they had no evidence. At this moment, one of the detectives decided that he needed to go through the routine, just for a clear conscience. He suggested checking Sharon's financial activity. This was not the most exciting step, but it could turn out to be useful. Perhaps something in her financial affairs or recent expenses could provide the necessary lead. This was a standard investigative action that few colleagues considered important, but it could bring unexpected results. It was this step that became the turning point. This was not the result of some insight or new analysis of evidence, but simply a bureaucratic check that would soon open up completely new horizons for the investigation. This would be the case when a routine check could reveal something important. The investigation, finding itself at a dead end, decided to return to standard investigative actions, checking financial transactions. For this, a report on Sharon Miller's credit card for March was requested. At first glance, this did not seem like something that could provide new information. Most transactions were normal for a housewife: grocery shopping, household goods, utility payments. But every step could lead to an unexpected discovery, and this was a chance that the investigators could not miss. And then, among the usual expenses, a strange transaction appeared in the statement. A purchase at a large hardware store, made one day before Olivia's disappearance. At first it seemed insignificant, but such a purchase immediately attracted the attention of investigators. What could a housewife be buying in such a store at such a difficult moment? Especially considering that on the day of the disappearance, there were no signs that Sharon was preparing for a large home project. This was curious, but nothing more, until the details became known. When the investigation requested details of the purchase, a new disturbing world opened up for them. In the list of goods, in addition to ordinary items, there was something more suspicious. The first two items, heavy-duty garbage bags and a large roll of plastic film, immediately made them think. These items are often associated with concealing evidence, which directly recalled the picture on which the police based their initial hypotheses. For the first time, items purchased a few days before the disappearance began to seem not just random purchases, but part of a carefully thought-out preparation. But that was not all. The receipt included one more item that immediately attracted attention: a gallon of industrial bleach. This item became a real shock for the investigation. Bleach is a substance that an ordinary person would hardly need for everyday needs. It is associated with removing traces, especially in the context of concealing blood, and now this entire purchase looked like a kit for destroying evidence. These items, purchased together, had no logical explanation in the ordinary life of a housewife. This could not have been a coincidence. Now, everything became clear. The purchase of these goods on one day, especially one day before Olivia's disappearance, spoke of preparation. This was not an impulsive act. This was a premeditated step. Sharon was not just acquiring household goods. She was preparing something much more serious. With this discovery, everything came together in a picture that was too logical to be accidental. At this stage of the investigation, suspicions about Sharon ceased to be intuitive and became based on material evidence. She was no longer just a mother whose behavior made investigators doubt. Now, the investigation had the first real lead that directly indicated her involvement in what happened. The purchases made one day before the disappearance could not have been anything other than preparation for the crime. This new data turned Sharon from a victim into a suspect. The investigation was now confident that she could be not only a witness to what happened, but also the organizer. The question now was different. Where did she get such skills? This was becoming a new bridge to further solving the case. The investigation had to understand what knowledge and experience could explain such precise actions. This opened the way for a new investigation, in which questions about Sharon's skills and past occupied a central place. At first glance, Sharon Miller seemed like an ordinary housewife. Her life was calm, filled with caring for her family and home. But recently revealed data and strange purchases made on the eve of Olivia's disappearance forced the investigation to pay attention to her past. Who was she before she married David Miller? What hidden aspects of her life could explain the set of skills that manifested itself in the dismemberment of the body? These questions haunted the investigators, and they decided that the key to the mystery might be in her past. Detectives requested university archives in case something in Sharon's past was hidden that could explain her knowledge and skills. Soon, an answer came from the University of Oregon, and with it, shocking information. It turned out that before she met David, Sharon's maiden name was Adams, and she studied at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine. This was the first serious confirmation that she had medical knowledge. But that was just the beginning. Investigators continued to study her academic history and soon learned that her specialization was surgery. Sharon studied what required precision and knowledge that could well explain the surgical precision of the perpetrator's actions. But what was even more surprising was that she dropped out of college after 2 years, as soon as she met her future husband, David. This small circumstance became an important link in the chain of evidence. Now that all this came together, it became clear. The skills Sharon acquired during her studies could not be forgotten. Surgery, although not completed, left its mark on her knowledge and ability to act with a precision that required not only physical, but also psychological preparation. These skills were ideally suited for performing dismemberment with such a cold, callous approach. And now, this fact turned her from an ordinary mother into the first candidate for the role of the crime organizer. The motive was clear: jealousy and fear of losing control. Olivia was an independent person who strived for independence, and her success in music and her intention to leave home to study in another city could be perceived by Sharon as a threat to her life and relationship with her husband. This was not just a fear of losing her daughter, but also a fear that her entire life, the ideal family project, could collapse. Now, the investigation could put together the full picture: the motive, the desire to maintain control over Olivia's life, the means, purchases that prepared her to commit the crime, and unique skills, medical education that gave her the necessary knowledge and skills to carry out her plan. All this now came together in a single, convincing formula. Based on the information received, the investigation decided to act. Documents were prepared to obtain a search warrant for the Millers' home with special equipment. This was a decisive step that would not only provide new evidence, but also give the investigation access to physical evidence. The operation was being prepared, and now the time had come for the police to enter the house where, perhaps, the last pieces of this terrible puzzle were hidden. On May 10, 2024, at the height of the investigation, a group of forensic experts entered the Millers' home. The search was sanctioned by the court, and now the case had reached the point where all doubts had to be dispelled and the facts revealed. Investigators knew that if they found even the slightest clue, it could be a turning point that would lead to the truth. All attention was focused on the garage, which, according to the case materials, could have been the place where the most important evidence was hidden. The garage was separated from the rest of the house, which provided ideal conditions for concealing traces of the crime. The interrogation room at the station remained empty as officers began preparing equipment for inspection. However, after a few minutes, forensic experts took out luminol, a chemical substance that could detect traces of blood, even if they had been carefully washed away. Luminol, capable of revealing hidden traces, became the last hope, and all eyes of the investigators were fixed on how this simple tool reacted to the surfaces they were carefully checking. While the search was going on in the garage, an equally tense event was taking place at the station. Sharon and David Miller sat at the interrogation tables, and their behavior differed from each other. David, experiencing the full weight of what was happening, nervously made excuses, emotionally denying his involvement, and talking about how he still couldn't believe what was happening. His words sounded sincere, but with each word, it became clear that he was trying to hide something important. In contrast, Sharon was cold and silent. She only repeated one thing: "I will only speak in the presence of a lawyer." Her silence was more frightening than any words. She looked as if she was absolutely confident in her innocence, but her silence began to raise doubts among investigators. And then, at the most critical moment, when the investigation was trying to take control of events, something happened that changed everything. A detective entered the interrogation room and quietly said something to the chief investigator. At the moment when the conversation was at its peak of tension, the floor in the garage flared up with a blue light. Luminol detected washed away traces of blood. This was not just evidence, it was confirmation that something had happened in this place. There were no longer any doubts. The blood had been washed away, but the traces remained. In parallel with this, everything in the interrogation room became even more tense. Sharon, upon learning of this, did not change her behavior. She remained calm, her face showing not the slightest emotion. All this time, while the investigation was trying to find out the truth, her silence was her defense. It is unlikely that anyone could hide their feelings if it was just a coincidence. Her silence seemed even more threatening than the words of her husband, who was trying to deflect suspicion from himself. Investigators knew that now they had enough information to take the next step. A new, decisive moment appeared on their investigation screen. Photographs from the crime scene, with material seized from the garage, were sent directly into Sharon's hands. When these pictures were presented to her, her face remained motionless. She showed no signs of guilt or fear. Silently accepting them, she did not even allow herself a faint reaction. This silence said much more than any answer. The next day, May 11, 2024, Sharon Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Everything that had happened up to this point turned out to be just preparation for the most dramatic culmination of the case. The investigation completed another stage, and now a new chapter was beginning, the fight for justice in court. Once the case went to court, Sharon's defense prepared its version of events. The lawyer claimed that the blood traces in the garage could have been an accident, a simple domestic incident that had nothing to do with the crime. However, the investigation had one piece of evidence that the defense could not so easily dispute. To finally dispel doubts, investigators understood that they needed to establish a direct link between Sharon and the place where the remains were found. This was important to place her at the crime scene. For this, the investigation decided to focus on Sharon's SUV. This car could become the key to solving the mystery. The car, like any other modern one, was equipped with a GPS navigator that accurately records all movements, even if a person is not aware of it. Investigators seized her car for technical examination, hoping to find data that could confirm their suspicions. The results of the examination came quickly. A working GPS tracker was found in the car's onboard computer, which recorded all trips. This was a real black box storing precise data about the car's location. And this data, as expected, showed something extremely important. Now, investigators could accurately know where Sharon was on the night of March 16 to 17, immediately after the incident occurred. Analyzing the GPS data for these nights, the police discovered two facts that left no room for doubt. It turned out that two identical trips were recorded during this period. In both trips, Sharon's car route led from the city to the east, towards the Mount Hood National Forest. This data perfectly coincided with the geography of the crime, and this was no longer a coincidence. The traces pointed to one place, the Salmon River Trail area, where the remains were later found. Now the investigation had 100% proof that Sharon was at the place where the crime occurred. This data was key for them, and now the connection between Sharon and the crime concealment location was established. All the defense she tried to hide behind became powerless in the face of such irrefutable evidence. But the investigation did not stop there. To rule out any possibility of error, it was decided to additionally check surveillance camera recordings on neighboring houses. These recordings could provide additional confirmation of Sharon's travel information. And as soon as they checked the cameras from nearby houses, it became clear. Sharon's car was recorded leaving the garage at 2 o'clock in the morning on March 16 on one of the cameras. This became visual confirmation of the entire story with the GPS data. Now everything fell into place. The connection between the killer and the crime scene was finally proven. The defense had practically no arguments left to continue claiming that Sharon had nothing to do with what happened. All the evidence now pointed to her. However, one important question remains: the motive. Everything now came down to why she took such extreme measures. This was the last brick that remained to fully unravel the picture of what happened. Despite all the evidence, Sharon Miller did not make a confession. She continued to deny all charges, claiming that she was not involved in the disappearance and the events that followed. The prosecution had only one thing left: to understand what made her take such extreme measures. After all, proving how is one thing, but why is quite another. For the jury to convince them of her guilt, it was necessary to find a clear motive that would explain her actions. Investigators, realizing that they had already dealt with physical evidence, began to search for an answer in Olivia's belongings, trying to find any hints of the relationship between mother and daughter. Correspondence, diaries, old photographs. All this could provide a key to understanding what was going on in Sharon's head. And then, among personal belongings, under the mattress in her room, a personal diary was found. This diary was a real discovery. It was the voice of the victim, speaking from the grave, the only way to understand what was really happening between mother and daughter in the last weeks of Olivia's life. The diary contained thoughts and experiences that, perhaps, would never have been voiced. As if going through these entries, the investigation tried to reconstruct the picture of what was happening, but each turn only added more horror. After reading excerpts from the diary, the prosecutor read out one of the most striking quotes, referring to the moment when Olivia received the news of her admission to Juilliard. "Mom made a scene about Juilliard. She said my leaving was a betrayal." These words showed how painful and difficult it was for Olivia to decide that her mother perceived her success as a threat. But this entry was only the beginning. Further followed even more disturbing lines. "Sometimes her gaze frightens me. She said she would rather I never left at all. Never." These words sounded like a direct threat. Now, looking at this in retrospect, they acquired new meaning. This was not just a fear of loss, but something deeper. Pathological attachment, narcissism, which made the mother perceive any step of Olivia towards independence as a personal betrayal. And this was the main motive, the fear of losing control, the fear that her daughter would leave her, a fear that turned into a real psychosis. The diary now became key evidence in this case. It provided a clear motive for the crime, which was as important as all other evidence. This artifact, the voice of the victim, provided the court with what they needed, a motive for the crime. Sharon's psychological portrait became clearer and clearer. This was not just a quarrel between mother and daughter. This was a pathological fear that led to destruction. This fear was characteristic of a narcissistic personality who could not allow herself to lose control. And Olivia, as a bright personality with her own ambitions, became a threat to this fragile system. Everything that happened was caused by an unfounded feeling of jealousy and fear. Now the prosecution had not only evidence, but also a clearly formulated motive. All the pieces of the puzzle connected. The investigation was ready to present this evidence in court. They had all the necessary elements: evidence, means, skills, and now, a clear motive. This meant that the case was coming to an end. Sharon was not just a suspect, she was guilty, and soon her actions would be the subject of a trial. In court, the prosecutor presented the jury with a detailed reconstruction of the events that led to Olivia's disappearance. This was an important part of the case that was supposed to unite all the evidence and facts into a single picture, allowing to understand exactly how the crime was committed. All stages, from beginning to end, now became clear and distinct. The first step in the crime was the immobilization of the victim. Toxicological analysis data showed that there were traces of sleeping pills in Olivia's tissues, which confirmed the version that she was unconscious before something terrible happened to her. Sharon mixed it into her evening tea, planning for her daughter to fall asleep and not be able to resist. This was a cold-blooded and carefully thought-out step that excluded the possibility of any struggle or scream. Everything was done quietly and discreetly. When Olivia fell asleep, Sharon, waiting for her daughter to fall into a deep sleep, suffocated her with a pillow. The medical report established that the cause of death was asphyxiation, and there were no signs of struggle. This moment of the crime became especially horrifying. The murder was committed in silence, leaving no traces of struggle or noises that could attract attention. Sharon was not only determined, but also acted with such cold calculation that it left no room for accident. After Olivia was deprived of life, Sharon moved her body to the garage. She used a wheelbarrow for this. This was one of the most eerie and mundane details of the crime. Nothing supernatural, just an ordinary wheelbarrow, but in its context, it acquired a new meaning. Sharon handled the physical part of the crime, acting quickly and efficiently. In the garage, on a spread-out tarp, Sharon began the dismemberment. Traces of blood and bleach, found later, directly indicated that it happened there. She possessed knowledge acquired in the past, when she studied to be a veterinary surgeon. These skills allowed her to dismember the body with surgical precision, leaving no traces that could betray her. Outwardly, everything looked like ordinary work with animals, but in reality, she used this knowledge for terrible purposes. Then, over 2 nights, Sharon transported the remains into the forest, where parts of the body were later found. This was confirmed by GPS data, which showed her car heading towards Mount Hood National Forest, where she disposed of the evidence. This data became the final piece in the reconstruction, allowing the investigation to fully restore the chain of events. Now, the judges, jury, and investigators had a complete picture of how everything happened. The reconstruction of events made it possible to accurately understand what occurred on the night of Olivia's disappearance. All evidence and facts converged into one terrible story, and now it only remained to present it in court. In court, the defense's last testimony came from Sharon's husband, David. He believed in her innocence until the very end. He described her as a loving mother, claiming he noticed nothing unusual in his wife's behavior. This testimony became the defense's last hope. When the cross-examination began, the prosecutor asked David a question that became a trap. "You claim your wife loved your daughter?" David confidently replied, "Yes." The prosecutor continued, "Then allow me to read what your daughter wrote about your wife's love." And he read excerpts from Olivia's diary, where she wrote about fear and how her mother perceived her success as betrayal. At this moment, David fell silent, covering his face with his hands and bursting into tears. This moment became the culmination of the trial. David could not defend his wife against the obvious truth. The jury retired for deliberation, which lasted less than 3 hours. It was clear the decision was unanimous. On September 10, 2025, Sharon Miller was found guilty. The judge read the sentence, 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. Sharon Miller was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. The trial concluded, but the consequences for all involved in this story continued. For her, life in prison would now be her only future. The fate of her husband, David, turned out differently. After the verdict, David sold the house where his family had lived for so many years and closed his dental practice. These were the first steps toward a new beginning. He could not remain in a place full of memories and lies. Too much was connected to this house, to this life he had lived with Sharon. Soon, he left, moving to another state and severing all ties with those who might remind him of the past. David's life was shattered, and now he continued to exist in the shadow of what had happened. This story remained almost unknown to the general public. At the request of David's relatives, who sought to avoid further public trauma, the case did not receive much press coverage. Everything happened quietly, hidden from public view. We are telling this story now as a forgotten and hidden one, emphasizing its tragedy and the internal struggle of those who remained on the sidelines. This is a story that no one would have heard if not for the decision to slightly unveil it before you. One important question remained unanswered. Did David know what was happening, or was he his wife's last victim? The investigation could not definitively prove or disprove his awareness. This was left to the conscience of everyone involved in this tragedy. Was he an accomplice in this terrible crime? Or did he simply not notice what was happening around him? This question perhaps will remain unanswered forever, like this entire story. Either way, Sharon will now spend the rest of her life in prison, and David, somewhere far from the place he once called home. But despite all these facts, the true cost of that tragedy, which destroyed their families, still cannot be measured. And perhaps this is what makes it truly chilling.